And thank you all of you who are here today now, and those of you who are able to come earlier today. Those of you who were able to come earlier today know you're in for an excellent treat. And those who don't yet know that, now know that. So we're in for a treat. Okay, so the spirit of the conversation this evening revolves around our visiting scholar, Dr. Sara Lipton's an op-ed piece that she wrote. Professor Lipton joins us from Stony Brook University, where she is a scholar of history, medieval history, Jewish studies, and she's an expert on many topics, including the topic of the origins of anti-Jewish imagery. She is widely published, including her first book, Images of Intolerance, which won a prize from the Medieval Academy of America, and her most recent acclaimed book, The Dark Mirror, The Medieval Origins of Anti-Jewish Iconography. Dr. Lipton's work is important for many reasons, including her agility in connecting historical ideas to, unfortunately, I told Dr. Lipton I was going to use the word unfortunately a lot today, unfortunately, to the present time. We would like it to be the case that sort of the idea of anti-Jewish or anti-other, anti-religious, anti-culture kind of rhetoric is something that's only something that Dr. Lipton talks to us about as an historian, but unfortunately that is not the case. And so in sort of thinking about her work, and there is an op-ed that she wrote a couple of years ago, The Words That Killed Medieval Jews. There's copies of the op-ed on the table there if folks would like, and it's available on our center's website. You can download it. It's also available on the New York Times, which is where it's from, but made it convenient for you on our webpage. The Words That Killed Medieval Jews, and the opening line that Sarah engages us with is, do harsh words lead to violent acts? And so, again, this was written in 2015. I believe it has become continuously timely, and in that spirit we are going to have a conversation with faculty from across arts, humanities, and social sciences in all different areas of expertise and in different perspectives, looking at different experiences that connect up with that question and related sort of pieces. With no further ado, we will start with our first panelist, who is our visiting scholar.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you again for the invitation to come here to Denver, which is beautiful, has much better weather than I left behind me in New York, and most importantly, a really stimulating and impressive and exciting intellectual community, students and faculty and guests that I've already enjoyed speaking to. You know, we might want to turn down the lights slightly. I already spent a lot of time talking this morning. I know most of you couldn't be there this morning. I don't want to repeat everything I said, and I really want to hear what my colleagues and the other panelists have to say, so I don't want to speak too long, but I thought I would just briefly explain why I came to write that op-ed piece and then what I did with it after I wrote it. I wrote it in December 2015, just as it was especially the Republican primary, presidential primary, was getting a lot of attention and a lot of media because of extremely strong, harsh rhetoric that was used, and especially kind of what was in the news was now President Trump really opening his campaign by saying that Mexicans were rapists, among other things, and then anti-Muslim rhetoric coming from a lot of the candidates in the Republican primary, talking about Islam being a religion of hate. At the same time, there was the lead up to, I had just previously spent the previous academic year, actually full year, in England, and there was the Brexit campaign was heating up, and there was very ugly rhetoric about the harm done by immigrants and Muslims and Syrians, Romanians and Poles going on there as well. And just as an aftermath, I should mention that in fact led to at least one and probably several murders, most notably a member of parliament who spoke out against the anti-immigrant movement was murdered by a proponent of the immigrant movement. And it was against that context that I was just having a conversation with a bunch of people, and I was mentioning how upset I was at the rhetoric, and they said, well, but isn't it just rhetoric? Does rhetoric have any real world effects? And how can we know? And I looked at them and I said, we can know because we have at least 1,500 years of history that lets us trace this sort of thing. I just wrote a book about that. And then I thought, of course, not a lot of people read dense books about the Middle Ages, so I wrote just a column, much less dense and much shorter, that was, judging from my email, read by a lot more people than my book ever will be. In that article, I really, because the New York Times, they actually did have a little illustration on the cover of the op-ed page, but they're not an illustrated paper, and they asked me to talk mostly about words and not about images, but I am equally concerned about the power of images, hateful images, to provoke prejudice, stereotyping, to direct and channel rage, and to accentuate and emphasize rage. So I just wanted to say a few reasons, that I think this is still painfully relevant, and why my study of anti-Jewish imagery from medieval Christian art, lets me actually, I think, recognize and parse and understand what's going on in some images that to people who don't know this history are a little bit opaque. They can't always spot what is anti-Semitic or hate-filled about them. And I think I just brought a few examples here to show you that, yes, this is related to the history of anti-Semitic imagery, but it's extended well beyond Jews. It's now being used against Muslims, especially, also in the Brexit debate, Polish immigrants, Romanian immigrants, Latino, both immigrants and residents here. And I think we saw very recently in Kansas, South Asian hardworking engineers, because of how they looked. Nobody has anything against South Asian engineers, but they looked the way the stereotypes lead people to believe immigrant parasite terrorists look, and that is what led at least one of them to be killed, the way he looked, and not what he did or who he was. So unfortunately, there's now a huge range of social media about which I'm looking to hear more about from Laleh, and I'm only a latecomer to this. Being a medievalist, I have not become, until recently, a scholar of Twitter, Reddit, 4chan, or these other places, but I have started looking at the hate speech and the hate images on these sites, and I just wanted to give you a short example for those of you who are lucky enough to not have to look at it. And I told the students this morning, one of the relatively new symbols, but working off an ancient tradition, is this symbol of Pepe the Frog. This frog character in this shape is known as Pepe. He was created by a comic artist, a graphic artist in the Northwest who is not an anti-Semite and had no intention of creating an anti-Semitic meme or symbol. He just wanted to create a funny little cartoon for himself and his friends about kind of weak, useless slackers. And something about this little comedy thing he created struck a chord with white supremacist alt-right denizens of the internet who feel emasculated and weakened by the changes in America around them and the UK around them. I really think that's the only explanation. They related to this slacker because they feel that they themselves have been sidelined and marginalized and weakened, and so they took him as a symbol and they kind of literally blow him up, making much larger than life, and then use him in all sorts of very aggressive contexts. Sometimes he embodies them, so he's actually hunting down or chasing or hurting Jews, and sometimes they sort of make him stand in for Jews, so he's actually quite a flexible symbol. And here he's wearing, it's a little bit hard to see because I had to blow it up so much, but that's a yarmulke there, a kippah, with the Star of David on it. And they exaggerated, I mean, Pepe in the original cartoon just had a froggy nose, but they now give him kind of a big hook nose to play off of the stereotype of the Jewish hook nose. And also the great big rubbery lips are actually part of the stereotype of Jewish caricature. And here he is smirking at the burning of the Twin Towers, and this plays into this whole kind of conspiracy theory among the alt-right that international Jewish capitalist conspiracy was behind 9/11. sometimes allied with Muslims and sometimes just directing Muslims, and sometimes they just say it wasn't even Muslims, it was Jews. And that's what that is right there. Of course, during the election, President Trump himself retweeted an image that was on a white supremacist website. It's never been explained what he was doing on a white supremacist website. He said he retweeted it without looking where it came from. And it says here, in case you don't know, Hillary Clinton, most corrupt candidate ever. And immediately the Anti-Defamation League excoriated him, saying this is anti-Semitic, this is a Star of David. President Trump then candidate Trump got very defensive and said, what are you talking about, a Star of David? It's just a six-sided star. That star appears in a lot of contexts. It could be a sheriff's badge. But, you know, obviously anyone who has studied the long history of the kind of slander of Jews and money and Jews and greed, and knows the visual history of the manipulations of the Jewish star. And again, I wanted to show you Pepe. There's a reason they put the Star of David on his kippah. That sort of condenses all of this anti-Jewish polemic that's gone on for centuries. It's very, very difficult to see. I never attribute specific motivation to any individual. You can't say what's in someone's mind, but you can certainly see the way it has to be read in a cultural context. And in a cultural context, those people who know this history have to read this as a subtle, what we would call anti-Semitic dog whistle. I mean, you've probably heard that phrase before. And sometimes people say to me, well, but you know this history, you've studied it, you know that the Star of David together with money has been used in all sorts of anti-Jewish posters and polemics and artworks, but you know, most people don't know that. And I agree, I say most people don't know that, but there are three kinds of people in the world who do know that. Number one, people like me who study it. Number two, graphic artists who are forced to take art history courses, and especially the history of graphic art, and know this history. But especially number three, anti-Semites. Anti-Semites study the history of anti-Semitism. They are experts in the history of anti-Semitism. So this is a dog whistle because people who know it and at whom this image is aiming hear it, and other people don't hear it. So there's a lot of plausible deniability. You can say, oh, well, I didn't mean it to be anti-Semitic because who knows who thinks that. And again, there are three people who think that. Scholars like me, the artist who made it, and the anti-Semites who are the intended audience for it. Here's another image of this time Pepe being the Jew hunter, and here we have a face that is just drawing on many, many, many centuries of anti-Jewish caricature. This is what a Jew looks like in caricature, a stereotype Jew. It's not what all Jews look like. It's not what most Jews look like. It's an exaggerated version of what some Jews look like. It's also an exaggerated version of what some non-Jews look like. I mean, everywhere you go, you see a range of people with a range of noses, a range of complexions, etc. But it doesn't matter in reality. Art is not about reality. Art is about codes. And in the visual code, this is a Jewish face. Here being hunted by, notice how the man is small, the frog is now big. This is realizing the fantasy of these white supremacists who feel marginalized and weakened, that they're going to be the big powerful ones hunting down the person who previously had power. He's wearing a t-shirt with the kind of ironically in light of recent events, the Russian insignia, because Jews traditionally have been associated with communism. Actually, quite paradoxically and illogically, Jews are associated both with communism and capitalism. Mutually exclusive in a logical sense, but makes perfect sense when they're simply voicing the fears and hatreds of people who feel caught between both kind of left-wing intellectuals and capitalist power brokers. But this face I wanted to show you, you can trace it directly back to at least the year 1300. It's basically the same face as this figure drawn in 1300 to illustrate a psalm line that was interpreted by Christian theologians as referring to Jews. Psalm 52 in the Vulgate, I only know the Catholic Bible, so I'm sorry, I think it's Psalm 53 in the Protestant Bible. No Protestants in my period, so I don't know the Protestant Bible. But Psalm 52 in the Catholic Bible, the fool saith in his heart there is no God. And going back to a great ancient Christian thinker, Cassiodorus, he glossed it as that is the Jew. And so they give it the face of a Jew, which was developed by 1300. And again, you see the same face in Lutheran anti-Semitic broadsheets. You see the same face in Holocaust anti-Semitic broadsheets. You see the same face on Reddit. Another turn that I'm very, very worried about. The first time I actually put this together in December 2015, I would tell audiences, I'm actually at this point a little less worried about anti-Semitism than I am about Islamophobia, about anti-immigrant violence, and both here and in the UK, because remember I was going back and forth. I unfortunately have to modify that. I'm using unfortunately too. Where's Sarah? Lots of unfortunately. Now I'm actually equally worried about anti-Semitism. A year and a half ago I was less worried about it than I am now. Now I'm worried about it all. I live in a state of worry. But the other thing that my scholarship has shown me is, I argue in my book that a lot of these images that ended up not reflecting anti-Semitism is my argument, but actually generating anti-Semitism, creating anti-Semitism, often were not initially directed against Jews. They were directed against other things. They were directed against sinners within the Catholic community, or they were directed against heretics. They simply needed to come up with a visual way of saying to be materialistic is bad, or to be a doubter in Christ's divinity is bad. And they came up with a Jewish way. And similarly, we see contemporary imagery using anti-Semitic tropes, which go back again to 1200 or 1300, against other groups. And this is a cartoon from the tabloid, the British tabloid, the London tabloid called the Daily Mail, which has been very, very, very pro-Brexit and very, very harsh in its anti-immigrant, anti-Syrian, Romanian, and Polish rhetoric, by one of their favorite cartoonists, and it's called Europe's Open Borders. It came out in November 2015, so right before I wrote my op-ed piece. And it's called Europe's Open Borders, and it shows, you know, the horrors that pour over the borders of Europe, and then potentially, because England was in Europe, UK was in Europe, into England itself, because of the open border policy. And again, you have to assume, because of what the Brexit campaigners were talking about, that these horrors were supposed to be Syrian refugees and Polish and Romanian economic migrants. I mean, this is what they were afraid of. These are the people who are mostly entering the UK via Europe. And yet, what do you make a Syrian refugee look like? What do you make a Pole look like? What do you make a Romanian look like? They had no visual vocabulary for any of that. And so they draw on the visual vocabulary of anti-Semitism, which again has a many hundred-year-old history. So what do I mean by that? You see just a lot of figures in profile. You see a lot of rats. And the only thing anybody in England talked about, thank you, was the rats. Some scholars say, oh, the rat, that's a very anti-Semitic image because Nazis often called Jews rats. And other people, I mean, people of very goodwill, an anthropologist who is by no means an anti-Semite or defender of anti-Semitism said, well, but rats can symbolize a lot of things in Western culture. It doesn't necessarily have to be Jews. And I sort of agree, it doesn't necessarily have to be Jews, but in the context of everything else. So what do I mean by everything else? So here's one of these figures. This is supposed to be a Syrian refugee. I mean, the Syrians who are coming are overwhelmingly secular middle-class professionals. Why is he wearing this sort of like turban-y fur hat? He has a big hooked nose, he has a scraggly beard, and this means he's wearing a pair of spectacles on his nose. Every one of those details comes out of anti-Jewish imagery. This is starting from the 15th century. Jews were shown in turbans because it was alleged that they were in cahoots with the Turks, who were then threatening Europe's borders and actually going even up to the gates of Vienna by the next century. So this is a Jew wearing a turban, and there was a lot of rhetoric about the Orientalized Jew. Spectacles. When spectacles were first invented in the 1400s, for 15 years, they showed up in art in a positive way. So people knew that spectacles make you see better. And so the first spectacles in Christian art are on the eyes of the writers of the Gospels. They show the great saints who wrote the Gospels, St. John, St. Matthew, wearing spectacles to show they had clearer vision than anybody else. And yet, after about 15, 20, 30 years of spectacles being around, people started to notice, well, who is it who actually wears spectacles? It's old men, old guys wear spectacles. And so the meaning quickly changed. It doesn't mean clear vision. It means, oh, those doddering old people who would be blind without them. So spectacles came to stand for blindness, and they soon began to be used on Jews. So this man here, this is the circumcision of Jesus, which according to theology, he underwent perfectly, willingly, to show his obedience to the law and his humanity. But and for hundreds of years, Christians had no polemic against the circumcision of Jesus at all. But by the end of the Middle Ages, anti-Semitism had built to the point where people saw this as like some kind of dry run for ritual child murder and for the crucifixion, and they make the men doing the circumcision be quite evil. And so we hear kind of an old guy frowning, and here's another guy with his glasses trying and failing to read the true words of Scripture. That's a way they showed that Jews have the revelation of God but don't understand it. So the spectacles became an anti-Jewish symbol. This particular hat, this is another man, the big nose, the beard. This is a different kind of hat, not a kaftan, but actually it comes right out of Soviet propaganda. It's kind of Eastern European military headgear, but this is a Soviet anti-Jewish cartoon. Most of you, well, half people here will remember CCCP being the Russian initials for the Soviet Union. Some of you won't remember. But the subtitle is "The Jew is the Bolshevik Ruler." So it's showing, it's Russian anti-Soviet propaganda saying that the Bolsheviks were basically all Jews and controlled by the Jews. So this is supposed to be a Jew with the big nose and this hat right here. And then over on the right, there was this figure. This might seem perplexing. What's like a fat businessman in old-fashioned knickers? Like, what in the world is he? And nobody in England even ventured to comment on that. But if you do what I do, better or worse for a living, you know immediately what this comes out of. This is a direct take from a Nazi children's book. And the title is "Trust No Fox in the Green Meadow and Trust No Jew on His Oath." This is how Nazis showed these devious Jewish capitalists. They always showed them in these old-fashioned striped or plaid knickers with great big fat bellies, carrying some kind of suitcase or briefcase and money bags to show that they're taking everything from everybody and getting fat off of it. And the knickers and the old-fashioned clothing shows they're sort of mired in the past. So this Brexit cartoon, and whatever else you say about the Brexit people, and I'm no fan of them, I mean, none of them have implicated Jews in any way in their problems. So why are they using all of this anti-Jewish imagery? Again, it's because they had no visual vocabulary for Romanians or Poles or Syrian refugees, but much more than that, because their own rhetoric did exactly the same kind of illogical conflation that anti-Semitic rhetoric does. So the two arguments that Brexiteers had is, we don't want immigrants because they're taking jobs away from our people, they're parasites on the public purse of the UK, so that makes them seem like, you know, low-class parasites, but at the same time, it's an anti-globalist rhetoric, you know, the international conspiracy of bankers, which is not at all subtle for which read Jewish. They're the ones who want London to be, you know, the center of finance and implicated in business, and they're the ones who are destroying sort of good old English nationalism and jobs for English people. So using this anti-Semitic imagery allows them to tap into all of the emotions that hundreds of years of seeing such images have generated, and to make these connections about this sort of vague conspiracy of simultaneously working class parasites and global capitalists, which has permeated discussions of Jews throughout at least the past 1,500 years of history. And that's all I want to say. Great, thank you so much. And thank you for, or not really, for letting me go after Sarah, but, because that was fantastic. The question that we were charged with, do harsh words lead to violent acts, is one that I want to address based on the work that I have been doing with the research on internment camps and Japanese American, and how we got to that place of internment camps, because as you can imagine, it's sort of undergirded by a poisoning of the civic dialogue. And so the way that I want to approach this is to think not so much about interpersonal violence, but about structural violence and about the violence of when people are denied their rights. And so when I give public talks about Japanese internment, people are often interested that I actually start with Chinese immigration. And because the kind of plot twist, again, our fear of the other goes back a long ways, but our fear of the Asian other in the United States really begins with the Chinese. And the Chinese are incredibly important in terms of the opening of the American West in particular, and of work on the railroad, which is what this picture shows. And that in particular, the most dangerous of the jobs that were involved in, for example, tunneling through the Sierra Mountains was done by Chinese laborers. And many of these laborers, after their labor contracts would end, would do things like start their own businesses, including, and some of these businesses would cater to other overseas Chinese, but many of them became associated with laundries. So here we have an association between particular ethnic groups and particular jobs that then gets played on by people who are trying to get rid of the Chinese, which pretty much happens as soon as the hard work of the building of the railroad is done. The Transcontinental Railroad is done, and now these Orientals can just go back home. And so this is accomplished in part, the arguments through absolutely vicious stereotyping. And they was a quote from a Colorado Civic leader, Horace Greeley. We have the town of Greeley, Colorado, who said, quote, "The Chinese are uncivilized, unclean," interestingly enough, "and filthy beyond all conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations, lustful and sensual in their dispositions. Every female is a prostitute of the basest order." So this sort of rhetoric and political will, especially by anti-immigration unions, pushed until there was the passage in 1882 of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was the very first piece of legislation to restrict and call out individuals from a specific country. So this is our first sort of pointing out of people based on national origin. And it is, again, sets this precedent for what would happen in the future. This anti-Asian sentiment remained powerful in the US despite the success of the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we continue to see it playing out in things like magazines and newspapers. But it also had some ironic unintended consequences. It was just as the door from China closes that the door from Japan opens. And so what we see is right after, in the mid-1880s, is when we start seeing Japanese laborers show up in the US, but sort of in the wake of all of this other sort of the yellow terror and yellow peril going on. Now, the Japanese Americans who come to the US, many of them start out in the same kinds of very heavy labor jobs that the Chinese had, so working on the railroad, mining, but we also see them gravitating towards fishing
and then eventually farming, because so many of them, the ones who were coming for economic gain, were in fact often the second or third sons of farmers. And so, used to very intensive farming practices in Japan, they were often took over relatively marginal land, but were able to make it very productive, which then, of course, drew the ire of many groups, again, unions, but also farmers' organizations and other landowning organizations. And they were able to successfully, in almost every state in the American West, except for Colorado, pass laws that made it illegal for first-generation Japanese to be able to own land. So this is the sort of rhetoric and the tone that has been set for when Pearl Harbor happens. So this is not a vacuum into which these bombs drop. And so the rhetoric that happens, the kind of combination both of words and imagery, has this long, deep genealogy. And when you start to see the things that come out right immediately after Pearl Harbor, they look very familiar. They draw on this, again, the visual iconography of the dangerous yellow terror with the scimitar, the sharp teeth, the pointed nails are the thing that you see over and over again. This one is particularly interesting because theoretically this is about not wasting metal, but clearly it's about a lot of other things as well. Note the pointed knife that is this time dripping blood, as well as this is actually drooling. And then this one, which people that I work with still remember to this day, walking into stores and seeing Jap hunting licenses. So not only is this a sort of a tacit promotion of violence, but it also is the ultimate in dehumanizing. So these are animals that you can hunt and in fact put as a trophy on your wall. So at the same time that we've got this sort of visual going on, we also have the war of the fake news. So we have a lot of reports that people are, the reason why people are ostensibly worked up is that the Japanese are going to be a threat to security, and that they are going to be spies, and there's going to be terrorism. And so what happens is you see a lot of these things, these incidents that are reported in the newspapers as real, that are not in fact. So this one, this plane reported down on Vermont Avenue was in fact a weather balloon. But then it gets picked up in Seattle in this letter to this editorial that says this and all of these other incidences, which in turn, none of them are proven founded. There's not a single Japanese American who's ever brought up on espionage during the entirety of World War II. But these are used to trump up, I've been using this for a long time, I'm sorry. They're using to trump up the case against Japanese Americans. And I love this image of the sort of Japanese response, as you can imagine, opening the paper and seeing this kind of over and over again that's happening. So where does this get us to? In February 19th, 1942, the signing of Executive Order 9066, which paves the way for the internment of Japanese Americans. This just had its 75th anniversary. It's time for us to think about the import of this. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that nowhere in here does it say anything about Japanese. So what it says is that the U.S. government has the Army can describe an area from which, quote, any or all persons can be excluded. So it is that, it's that any person that is really a dangerous precedent of the executive order. So within a couple of weeks, the west coast of the United States is designated as one of these, and it's an area from which all people of Japanese ancestry will be excluded. And in the lead up to the exclusion, there was not a single Western governor who was willing to take Japanese from the exclusion zone except Governor Carr of Colorado. And it was probably the end of his political career, because he said that they were just as loyal and that they were welcome in Colorado. So when it became clear that the Western governors would not actually take people unless they were actually under lock and key, then the roundup and the incarceration begins. And something that's really interesting is that that process was overseen by a new civilian administration, the War Relocation Authority. And the War Relocation Authority hired photographers to document the process. And as opposed to that propaganda that I've been showing you, the photographs humanized the people who were caught up in this, particularly, again, does she look like a threat? This little girl. And so they were in fact censored by the US. So these are only now recently available, these Dorothea Lange. And she had done such a good job of humanizing and the people who were suffering in the Depression, and she did it here as well. The sad irony of this is that, of course, the rounding up of Japanese Americans did not, in fact, make us safer. It was the opposite. It was a drain on the finances of the Army, and in fact, the Navy, the leaders in the Navy were actually very vocal about the fact that it shouldn't happen, because we needed our efforts to fight the war. We also have taken our best farmers and put them into camps at a time of food shortage, and we are losing the intellectual capital we need to fight our enemy. So I like to call this article the forehead slap heard round the world, which is, oh wait, everybody who speaks Japanese we have imprisoned. We might need them. But I want to end as maybe in some way a kind of palate cleanser of images that have been shared with me as I've been doing my research, my community-based research on the camp, to think about the patriotism, the ironic patriotism of the folks in the camp, who many of felt like they were going to go and not fight this because this was part of their duty to help the winning of the war. And these are, again, the kinds of imagery that people didn't see of Japanese Americans during World War II. So I'm going to end with that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to awkwardly hold my iPad of notes. But I'd just like to start by thanking you all for coming, and particularly thanking you for coming. So when I was asked to think about questions of kind of imagery and language and violence, I of course gravitated to abortion politics and started thinking about those things over the last few decades of American abortion politics. And while it's oftentimes, I think, arguably hard to make connections between law or language and imagery and kind of violence, abortion politics provide us some pretty concrete examples. So what I wanted to do is kind of go through language and imagery and so forth and move forward from there. So the first is just looking at anti-abortion activist language. And there's a very specific vocabulary that's meant to both delegitimize and demonize their opponents. So abortion doesn't involve doctors, for example. It involves abortionists. Abortion doesn't take place at medical facilities or clinics. It takes place at abortion mills, or sometimes other terms are used. And it doesn't involve patients, but it involves victims. And victims are not defined as victims because of poverty or other circumstances that may motivate people to seek abortions, but rather they're viewed as victims because they are victims of abortion providers, who are oftentimes, and by the way, find a lot of mixed imagery pulling from anti-Semitism. I got a lot of comments in interviews talking about the monetary motivations and greed that drives Planned Parenthood, for example. And then this is part of a larger pulling from a repertoire of kind of recognized cultural evils. So you get a lot of parallels drawn between abortion providers and Nazis. There have been claims about abortion being a genocide perpetrated by the state against the African American community. So all of this, like I said, goes to dehumanize opponents and to also try to out-of-pocket delegitimize abortion. And this is then reinforced or kind of echoed in the imagery that you can oftentimes find with abortion protests. So I'm sure everybody here is familiar with kind of the standard fare of posters at abortion protests. So the idea of the aborted fetus and so forth. And the intent here, right, is to tap into the visceral emotion, right? It's not intended to prompt thoughtful reflection or informed discussion, but rather to trigger something emotional. And imagery and language and emotion were then all kind of used to mobilize a group of people. So we oftentimes think of abortion politics as kind of always having been here, right? But it's something that had to be very, or the other story is that it emerges right after Roe versus Wade. Both of those things are wrong, right? It's something that had to be created over time. We don't really get the contemporary anti-abortion movement until the late 70s, early 1980s. And this is part of a larger story about the creation of the Christian right. But in the story, while abortion is just kind of one component, it tends to get the most attention because it's the most public, it's the most visual, and it's the most visceral kind of component of this. So we're all familiar with the kind of the, if not the language, at least the imagery of anti-abortion activism, largely because it worked, right? It worked to mobilize a group of people to become activists. And those people were then funneled towards a form of activism that was very public, right? And this strategy of targeting clinics and personnel and patients led to various outcomes that you can kind of plot along a spectrum of violence, right? So at one end, there's the undisputed violence of clinic bombings, right? Of targeted assassinations of abortion providers, right? From there, you can move towards mail threats, phone threats, and other threats to clinics and to providers that oftentimes prompted police responses, and in some cases, the people I interviewed, they would get trained by the FBI on how to deal with these kinds of threats. And we're kind of traveling down this spectrum. This all isn't quite linear, but we can pretend it is. Another one is home protests. So anti-abortion activists who break kind of the public-private barrier, right, and would target abortion providers at their homes, right? And because it's breaching that public-private divide, you can see it as a form of targeted violence. Right? Of course, we also have clinic shutdowns, right, Operation Rescue and so forth. And you can think about those in terms of violence, but you could, and then kind of moving along, there are kind of the smaller, more everyday protests. Instead of the big Operation Rescue kind of shutdowns, the more everyday, small groups of people approaching those that are trying to get in and out of Planned Parenthood clinics. Oftentimes those are things that we expect people to just kind of lump to bear, right? But if you talk to abortion providers and people trying to access clinics, they view it as a form of violence, right? So all of the above, the reason I'm giving you this spectrum is we're going back to that original question, right? Of do words, do images prompt violence? And as I was trying to put this out there is these visceral images and kind of graphic language were intended to mobilize people, right? And many people in the anti-abortion movement arguably didn't seem to, or didn't seek rather, to want to inspire kind of the most egregious forms of violence here. There are questions about kind of culpability for setting the context for that, but the intent wasn't to create the most extreme forms of violence. Some groups, however, did, right? So the way that I got into this research was actually a court case out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that was about two websites. There was the Nuremberg Files and the Dirty Dozen, right? And what these were websites, anti-abortion websites, that employed images like Wild West posters, right? And they would put up pictures of abortion providers on these Wild West posters, wanted dead or alive, right? Or what other sites did was provide address information about abortion providers and their names. And then if people on that list were ever harmed in some capacity, they would gray out the name. If they were ever killed, they would draw a line through the name, right? So the language kind of Western posters, the Nazi, explicit Nazi parallel with the Nuremberg Files, right? They were repurposed in order to frame abortion in a certain way and to produce certain results, right? These were not doctors, these were not people, these were wanted violent criminals, right? And the posters inspire this idea of wanted dead or alive, of vigilante justice. The state is failing us. They are not taking care of these criminals, so it is up to us to do so. And then there's a form of violent scorekeeping, right, on the website in terms of what happens to these providers. So Dr. Lipton's work talks about how kind of centuries of conditioning created violence, even when that violence wasn't initially kind of intended. Abortion is a story of kind of years and decades, right? Not of centuries in terms of American abortion politics. And kind of the language and visual imagery of abortion politics spread rapidly, has been consumed and kind of redeployed quickly, and has led to this range, like I said, this range of what you can think of as violent outcomes. But the contemporary story of abortion politics is one where violence has become marginalized. And this is where, in my planning the talk, I was like, everything's going to be a downer. Let's try to find but it doesn't quite work totally as the positive palate cleansing arc. But violence is largely, and violent imagery and language has largely taken a back seat in contemporary abortion politics. It still exists, we're still reminded of it through the Trump campaign, through the uptick actually in clinic front protesting and activism that's happened since Trump's election. You get reminded of it through the shootings in the Springs. It is, however, still arguably fringe, right? The mainstream of the movement has actively worked to try to marginalize violence. In fact, the rhetoric now of the mainstream anti-abortion movement is about their being the champions of women's health and safety, right? This still assumes that providers are threats in some capacity, but it's much less direct and in terms of kind of stoking violence. And this is where kind of the starts going back down, maybe, is the move to stop demonizing opponents didn't come through kind of a realization of the humanity of doctors and of providers and of the women that were being targeted. Rather, it was strategic, right? Extreme violence was recognized by the anti-abortion movement as both demobilizing activists, their activists, and also being demonized in the public, right? So it stopped having kind of utility. So the story leads to kind of a mixed conclusion here. One is it illustrates the importance of making sure that political organizations and activists recognize the dangers of kind of tapping into visceral appeals and demonization in terms of mobilizing activists. It also brings up the importance of the public being able to identify when these strategies are being used, right? And so that the public can also participate in marginalizing and delegitimizing and stigmatizing violence. We also then can recognize the importance of the state, of institutions, and of movement language in terms of whether it feeds or works against this kind of discourse and appeals. And while that all is kind of potentially positive or something to work with, a disturbing lesson from the wider anti-abortion movement is that you don't get this change until you get innocent or more arguably sympathetic blood being spilt, right? So, and it's only at that point in time that the movement starts to transition away from this tapping into the visceral and creating the context of the violence. So I'm going to end there.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. And just in hearing the first few, sorry, this overhang just kind of disappeared. I'll try to speak louder. This conversation is timely for a lot of reasons. Actually, it was just last night I was giving a talk to some alumni. And one of the things that I mentioned in my comments is that we are currently in a moment where it seems like immigration is out of control. People are pouring across the border, threatening to tear the fabric of our society. But the reality is that this is a moment we've actually experienced before. And if we look to the history of anti-immigrant sentiment, it certainly has its roots with the very earliest waves of immigrants to this country. So some of the images that I have here show the many ways in which immigrants, these so-called newcomers, were depicted. And Dr. Lipton and also Bonnie show some of these images, and you'll hopefully start to see some of the commonalities with regard to these particular portrayals. Once I show you some of those images, I then want to kind of go back and connect to what we're experiencing today and the ways in which the anti-immigrant rhetoric is perhaps a little bit different than what we've seen before. And then go back to this important question of, do harsh words lead to violent acts? So these are just some examples of images that are available through the Library of Congress. They might be a little bit difficult to read, but it speaks to some examples of the context of reception as far as the portrayals of immigrants. So with each wave, we see the portrayals sort of playing upon certain stereotypes of those groups, but then also you start to notice some common elements with regard to the various nations of origin. So we see here in this first image, it's Uncle Sam welcoming immigrants into the country. And then you can see the comparison to that, whereas these individuals were peasants upon arrival, suddenly they become the quote-unquote sort of fat cats in society. But you can see sort of the shadows or images behind them are the peasant versions of themselves. Here we see an example. Actually, it's a very common trope in a lot of these political cartoons, the use of Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty, especially this idea that they're under distress because of the immigration. And so what we have here is Lady Liberty, but she's being pulled down by the various ethnic groups that are coming to this country. So we see some examples of some of those threatening to undermine her stability. Here's one of my, I guess, favorites, if anti-immigrant political cartoons can be a favorite. It's called Uncle Sam's Lodging House. And we see here Uncle Sam, who can't sleep because of all the rowdy immigrants who are keeping him awake. So we see Spaniard, Frenchman, we see Russian, German, Irishman, and so forth. They're just causing such a cacophony that poor Uncle Sam can't sleep. Here we see sort of another example of this. This one's a little bit more difficult to decipher because it's a little bit darker, but it's a similar idea that Uncle Sam is trying to kick out all of these bedfellows from bed so that he can get some rest. You see, for example, a Native American person, an African American. You see the Irishman with his bottle of whiskey beside him. Of course, the exclusion of the Chinese, and so forth. Here we see an example of a German immigrant. Notice that he's carrying his lager on his back. The Irish. The Irish were coming to this country. Not only were they coming, but they were bringing poverty. They were reproducing. They were living off the state. And then one of the things that I think is really important that we start to see is that the Irish increasingly start to take on a particular persona. That is to say that you start to see more of these images of Irish immigrants with simian or ape-like qualities, right? This was part of the dehumanization of Irish immigrants. Here again, another example of Irish, hard at work. They come to the US and suddenly they're lazy and not working. Here we see another example of an Irish immigrant staring at the face of an ape, and it says at the bottom, mutual, this idea that they're staring into one another's eyes. Here's another example. This was from Harper's Weekly. It's the ignorant vote. Who is more ignorant, African Americans or Irish? And of course, as Bonnie said, a lot of this sentiment was directed at Asian immigrants around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can see, for example, this piece of this vase, and you can see sort of the dragon that's wrapped around it. And if you take a closer look, you can see the American flag hanging upside down, right? The country is in distress. The yellow dragon, another popular sentiment. This is another one that sort of speaks to some of what we've been showing and saying. Uncle Sam being consumed by an Irishman and a Chinese immigrant. There's the image that Bonnie showed earlier, which is a really good one to show some of this sentiment. Chinese, I mean, there's really countless that you can show. Here's one that perhaps speaks best to what we were talking about earlier. You see the bodies of rats, and yet the heads of these individuals with the beard and the hooked nose and so forth that we were talking about before. Here are some other ones. You can see, for example, the dark stranger, the notion of someone coming through town and no one quite knows who this person is. They're kind of suspicious. There's a sense that they don't quite belong. Here we see an example of Uncle Sam portrayed in the way that Sarah was talking about earlier. Questioning this notion of the melting pot. You know, there's the Irishman again, who's not quite melting the way they're supposed to. We see the anti-Japanese rhetoric as we start moving into the 20th century. Literacy tests. Here we see an anti-immigration pamphlet warning about the perils of immigrants to business. Protect yourself and your children. We see some sort of political propaganda, the Americanization programs, and so forth. So all of these are examples of the ways in which immigrants to this country have been portrayed, right? These very particular images as a way to signal that somehow these are newcomers who don't quite belong, right? That they're unassimilable, that they don't have the same values that we do. And so it's perhaps not surprising that a lot of these political cartoons reached their height around the time when these waves were coming through to the US. Okay, so to the extent that that's the case, and we could trace back to the 1800s, we can say that none of this sentiment is necessarily new. What is new is if we think about what started to change with regard to the immigrants, where they were coming from, their countries of origin. Around the 1950s and 1960s, we start to see that increasingly those immigrants are coming from countries where the individuals are perhaps more ethnic in some way or phenotypically distinct in a way that makes them more visible and therefore more likely to be targeted for a lot of this sentiment and rhetoric. That was especially the case starting in the 1980s with the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, where more and more of that migration was increasingly coming from Latin America and also part from Asian countries as well. So as that sort of ethnic character started to change, that's where we start to see increasing emphasis in portraying them as sort of these immigrant others. And along with that, we see the rhetoric, which unfortunately is increasingly being used as a target, not only of certain groups, but also in terms of the policies that are trying to target those groups as well. Oops, I don't know why that popped up. This is actually some examples of more recent sort of political cartoons, if you will, talking about the invasion in terms of war and the invasion from immigrants. Statue of Liberty, again, being taken over by the tsunami of immigrants. This is a particularly problematic. This is a video game where you not only see the stereotypical characters, the Mexican nationalist, the drug smuggler, and the breeder, but the purpose of this game is to kill as many immigrants as you can. That's how you win at this particular game, right? So we see the similar kind of thread here. What we're also seeing, and this is actually something that we saw a great bit of during the presidential campaign, is this increasing notion of immigrant criminality. And one of the things that is really important, I think, for sharing is the fact that despite what we heard during the campaign, and despite what we're still hearing today, this is actually a myth. Immigrants are no more likely to commit a crime, and in fact are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Of course, if you couple those sentiments with what's been happening, especially during times of economic decline, it becomes increasingly popular to scapegoat, to use these sentiments as a way of not only othering these immigrants, but also as a way of sort of placing blame on them for what are structural conditions beyond the control of any individual, right? I mean, what's happening is at such a structural level in terms of the decline of manufacturing jobs, the shift to the service sector, economic recession in 2008, right? Those are not things that immigrants themselves have caused, but they are increasingly blamed and targeted as the culprit of these problems. I want to conclude with just some thoughts about whether or not these sentiments lead to violent acts. And there's a good bit of data coming from the FBI in conjunction with the Civil Rights Project to suggest that it does. And that's attributed to a couple of things. One is the rise of anti-immigrant groups. Since the 1990s and to the present, there's been a proliferation of groups who've really tried to target not only immigrants, but specifically Latino immigrants. So with these organizations, and increasingly organizations that have a presence on the internet, we can see that a lot of that anti-immigrant sentiment and rhetoric is tied to these particular groups. Another really important factor in this is the role of conservative media. Starting with the rise of Fox News and specific personalities on that channel like Lou Dobbs. This was actually something that they would talk about every night. This notion of immigrants coming into this country and stealing jobs and living off welfare was something that you could expect to watch pretty much every night if you tuned in. And these are just some of the words or language that Dobbs and others have used in describing Latino immigrants. One of the very favorite terms is anchor babies, right? Immigrants come to this country, they have children who are US citizens, therefore they are anchor babies. He frequently uses the term invasion or army of invaders to refer to them. In 2005, he linked immigrants to diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, and leprosy. He's often featured anti-immigrant groups like the Minutemen and others who have led many of these movements. One year he brought on a medical expert who was not actually a medical doctor, but who felt that they brought diseases to this country and also felt that Mexican immigrants were prone to molesting children. Right. So these are some of the sentiments that we see with regard to the conservative media. Now, in terms of this question of do harsh words lead to violent acts, there is lots of evidence to suggest that the number of incidents targeting immigrants, not immigrants causing crime, but targeting immigrants, has increased since the early 2000s. And there are a couple of cases in particular that stick out as examples of this. One was an example of a man by the name of Luis Ramirez who was killed in Hazleton, or near Hazleton, Pennsylvania, about a year after Dobbs had held a community forum praising the town for passing an illegal immigration relief act. And he called these people heroes. He praised them for finally doing something about the immigrant menace. And then it was shortly after that Luis Ramirez was killed. 4 young men were implicated in his murder. 2 of the teenagers apparently yelled, "This is Shenandoah, this is America, go back to Mexico." As Ramirez lay unconscious, convulsing and foaming at the mouth, one of the assailants told him to tell his Mexican friends that they needed to get out or that they would be laying next to him. So an example of the ways in which harsh words can lead to violent acts. And what I want to just kind of end on here very quickly is to go back to something that was mentioned before with regard to this notion of dog whistles, right? The ways in which certain words are used as coded language when we're speaking about particular groups. So these so-called dog whistles, I would argue, are increasingly bullhorns, right? It's not so much a dog whistle as a bullhorn, right? When you have a candidate who starts their entire campaign by saying they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and maybe if some of them are good people, that's giving carte blanche to people to really sort of engage in this kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric. So rather than a dog whistle, I would say we're now using a bullhorn. And what all of this really sort of serves the purpose of, and I think it goes back to the examples that I showed from the 1800s and early 1900s, is that a lot of this ultimately comes down to trying to define who we are by defining who we're not. Right? Who are these others? Who are these people who are outsiders? Who are the ones who belong versus don't belong? So I'll stop there.
All right. So I want to talk about words, about images, about alienation, and then I want to turn around and talk about the flip side of art as a way of propagating hate and violence, and talk about art in the form of music, a musical thing, as a counter-narrative to it. And I want to preface this by saying that part of how I do my work as an academic really is framed a lot by my early training as a psychotherapist. And that training emphasized a couple of things. One was the use of personal experience as a way to really observe what happens in interpersonal interactions and also in the culture. And then a sort of sometimes over preoccupation with the idea of intervention. So it's like you're always going to, how can I solve this problem? And sometimes I have to put brakes on myself in terms of thinking about a problem that's really so big that it's not capable of being solved. But I told Sarah when she asked me to do this that I thought the best contribution that I could make to the panel tonight was to talk about a personal experience, just in the spirit of how I've been trained, that left a profound impact on me in terms of my understanding of some of these issues. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about what happened, try to make it as brief as I can, and something about kind of the lessons that I learned out of it. So this was during a time, during the mid-'80s, I decided that I needed to be singing again, because when I was a teenager, my most important thing that I did when I was in high school was singing. I just lived for all the opportunities that I had to do that. When I decided to become a psychologist, I thought, well, that was a childish thing to do, and I should put that away. But later, when I got into my 40s, I decided to need to be doing that again. And in the this was sort of like the mid-'90s, I had this experience where a friend of mine, a Jewish friend of mine, had a son who had committed suicide. And they had a funeral for him at a Jewish temple here in Denver. And she asked me if I would sing at the temple. And of course I said yes, I would do it. And I had this very alienating experience doing it. I wanted to do it. But I had to be vetted by the rabbi. He had to be sure that I wasn't going to proselytize or sing some Christian song that was inappropriate. He had me sing the song that I was going to sing over the telephone so he could hear it. And then when I actually went to the temple and I was on the program and it was my time to sing, my last name is Jones, Jones. He introduced me as Arthur Jonas. It was as if I was some kind of alien person entering into the space. And I was really trying to draw on my powers of empathy to try to understand it all. And one of the things that ended up happening serendipitously, which ended up creating this other fabulous learning experience that I got, was that the cantor who was associated with that temple came to me after the service to apologize for what had happened. And then she and I struck up a conversation about the alienation that was currently happening between the African American and Jewish communities across the country. This was several years after Jesse Jackson had, in a private meeting, talked about Jews in Hymietown, this derogatory thing. And that word, his use of that word had created all this horrible stuff. It was also a time when African Americans in the country were really feeling like we had gone through the civil rights movement, and now we still had all this stuff. I mean, it was still there, everything was there, but people were abandoning the community. And in the African American community, they were just picking out of the air all of these images about Jews, right? And sort of blaming a lot of that on Jews. And so there was an alienation from the black community to the other way around. So she and I had, we had this great chemistry between us, and we started talking, and we drummed up this idea of what if we created a program? What if we planned an event where we could bring together African American and Jewish communities in a program of story and song? We started talking about the common histories of African Americans and Jews in terms of dealing with oppression and all of that stuff, and we talked about, what could we do? And we decided that we would use the African American spiritual "Go Down Moses" as the label for the program, because it was a spiritual that was created by African American slaves, but it's also a song that has been adopted by the Jewish community, and it's also often sung at Passover and so forth. And so we spent hours. She had a young child, and so we would meet at her house in her kitchen over lunch and stuff. We spent hours sort of talking about it. Eventually, we came up with this plan that we would invite an African-American storyteller and a Jewish storyteller. We'd have an African-American gospel choir and the Hebrew chorale. We'd have Jewish cantors and African-American soloists, and we would all come together, and I would work in the African-American community to bring people into the program. She would work in the Jewish community to bring people in. And both of us had this experience of a lot of resistance. People didn't really want to do it. When I went and tried to recruit people in the black community, why should we get together with those Jews? What have they done for us? And hers, well, I don't know, Jesse Jackson hates us, and he's supposed to represent all of us, of course, right? But eventually we coerced people to come, and we got, and I came up with this brilliant idea because we had no money, no funding for this, that because I was a professor at DU, I could use, at that time we had two campuses. We had a Park Hill campus, and a Park Hill campus, they had this chapel that was called the Watley Chapel, that the Colorado Women's College used at that, historically. It's a beautiful chapel that was designed by a French architect, and it has fantastic acoustics. So we were thinking about that. So I thought, I can get that for free because I'm a professor. And she said, oh, great. So we planned this, and then we got all the artists together for a dress rehearsal, and she and I got there early, and then what happened was the Hebrew chorale they were the first people to arrive, and as they walked into the chapel, they got about halfway down the aisle, and they abruptly turned around and left, and I was like, what's going on here? And what happened was their director stayed, and she said, well, the reason why they left was because of that symbol. And I said, what symbol? So I'd been in this chapel many times. It was a huge cross, right, that was on the altar that was about 15 feet that went, across the thing. And for those people entering, this was a symbol of that. This is a cross that had been used as a symbol to blame Jews for the death of Christ and all these other stuff. I had no idea, right? So it's a good example of how when you are not the person who's had the experience of being oppressed in a certain way, you're unconscious about it. So I had never even seen the cross before. I mean, I didn't even notice it was there, right? But they noticed, right? And so and then Galit, who was the cantor, was feeling really guilty that she should have thought of that. She was feeling like it was her fault. And she and I ended up spending the weekend talking with the director of the chorale, and she talked with people, and we tried to get them back in. And we eventually, about 75% of them decided to join the program, and we had it, and we had a small circle a small audience of African Americans and Jewish people. But the program itself was a phenomenal success. The storyteller the African American storyteller who had been the most resistant to joining this thing, came up afterwards and hugged me and told me, she said, I had no idea how powerful this would be, coming together with this experience of music. She said, if we're going to do this again, count me in. And this became just this incredible thing. I was, at that time, I just finished a book that I had written about the power of the spirituals, and people, as a psychologist, were asking me if I did music therapy. And I said, no, I wasn't really interested in having people come into an office and doing an intervention in the office. I was interested in teaching people about the power of the music that's in the culture and what that can do for people. And this experience taught me about the power of the music to bring different communities together, which I hadn't thought of before. We ended up doing 2 more of these programs, successive, and by the third year, it was standing room only. People were asking us, when was it going to be? And it was just an incredibly powerful experience for me to think that there was something that we could do. But I'm also humble in understanding this is like a really small thing, but it has helped me to continue to feel really committed to this idea of communal music as an intervention. And as many of you know, I founded a project called the Spirituals Project that is about preserving and revitalizing these songs that slaves created. And just this year now, the project is actually officially part of the university, which is really great. But I learned something about alienation, and also about being unconscious when you're in the other group. I mean, I'm always talking about to white people about racism and all the things that are obvious to black people. But here I am in a situation where I was oblivious to things were happening in another community. So I learned a lot about that, learned how to pay attention and how to really be conscious about that. But I also learned about some of the ways that we can actually come together through an art form like music to do something. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Sarah for including me on this panel. I feel a little bit or a lot anxious as the only visual artist in this pool of incredible scholars. And thank you to Dr. Lipton. I found the article to be such a fantastic historical context to something that everyone keeps saying to me that my work is now so relevant. And I'm like, really? Because it's been relevant for a few decades. And I'm, like as artists say, I'm happy other folks are awakening. But it's also really critical to understand that this is not new in any context. Keyword, it's like the shot word for the day. Unfortunately, it's been going on for hundreds of years. So I am going to show just some one project and some visuals. So I wanted to make a perfect cube. So immediately, right, and I am Iranian. I'm one of the 7. I'm also one of the original axes of evil. So this was created with the understanding that it is not a replication of any of those things, right? Obviously, it's referencing them. I understand those pieces. I understand that there's similarities, but I am not making a replica for those who can't do a pilgrimage because they're not Muslim, that they can come here and check this out. And this came up quite often in really, in some ways, alarming ways where folks would thank me for bringing this here. And I thought, this is not a good thing, because the museum staff was really, really anxious and hovering every time this came up. So outside of this perfect cube, I wanted to have an organic topology that actually addresses some of these fanaticisms and some of these issues. So it's a topography of the Middle East, and it has all this organic waveform that goes across. And one of the things that was important to me as I had this was to, in some ways, unwrap and unveil something that's so perfect in a more organic shape, which is the topography, but without actually borders of the countries. To get this information was really impossible. It's on lockdown. You cannot get the topography of the Middle East because, goodness knows what you're going to do with it. And I was like, trust me, I have nothing nefarious. It's all good. But I had to actually go to our own GIS department to get this information on lockdown, and they had to like log in and all of these things. So I was looking online, which I'm sure put me on yet another list, and everything I've kept finding was in Russian. So now I'm like, holy crap, I am like now, like, you know, like, I didn't know if I had a crystal ball, like, so I'm like rising to the top of all kinds of things. And here it is cut out in here. And of course, it does also make reference to the actual pilgrimage and going around the house of God in a counterclockwise formation. These orbs are then in some ways mimicked and echoed on the very apex of the gallery. And here's an image. So from these cracks, these particles are endlessly coming in this almost gravitational force as they come, and then you see them in the space. And one of the things I would like to mention is in 2012, I look quite distressed. So Voice of America was here because we had the debates for the second election. And they asked me, they were like, oh, you're Iranian, we totally want to interview you. And I said to them, I will not discuss politics with you. And my show happened to be, the exhibit was at the Denver Art Museum. So of course they filmed it. They relentlessly asked me questions in Farsi. And I stood as clear away from answering them as I could. Because I have family there, and the answers and the things I do here impact them, and they impact my family here. I am like in an orbital bubble of self-censorship because anything I do actually has alarming impact. This isn't like a cute little, tweet that's going to be a problem. This is like serious things like jail, lashing, and death. So I was freaking out, which is probably why I'm making this face. I didn't realize it was broadcast immediately to Iran. I get home, I have 1,000 phone calls from my family saying, we just saw you on TV. They're all excited. And I was like, am I in trouble? And they're like, no, you did good, you did good. Oh, but you're on the list. And I was like, how many lists are there? Like, because Voice of America is seen as basically propaganda from the US and other countries. So awesome, so I'm gonna get on. I'm doing good on my list. So in conclusion, I just want to talk about visual coding and what it means when your creative visual works actually reference a whole set of critical concepts that become diffused because they're then perceived as something else, either through your name as text or through the imagery, and then you're thought to be making some propaganda of something else rather than actually the critique of that in itself. Thank you.
Piece as it connects to some of my interests within social movement, and that is the part that connects and kind of builds this question and the justification for it. Do harsh words lead to violent acts? To recent, as Professor Lipton writes, shooting deaths of police officers in California, Texas, and Illinois, which some have attributed to anti-police sentiment expressed at Black Lives Matter protests. And so one of the claims that I'd like to advance in response is that our understanding and evaluation of words and violence must be contextually grounded, particularly as it relates to protests against police brutality, and that words and images that dehumanize cannot be uncoupled from the people or political formations that are a part of those struggles. And so I want to start with a kind of case study of an example of another case in time, and this is the Black Panthers activism in 1967, in which they took over, that's not even the right word, they formulated a really great protest at the California State Capitol. And I wanted to start with the words of the Black Panther leader, Bobby Seale, which actually were spoken after the protest before I show the images. Black people have begged, prayed, petitioned, demonstrated, and everything else to get the racist power structure of America to right the wrongs which have historically been perpetrated against Black people. All of these efforts have been answered by more repression, deceit, and hypocrisy. As the aggression of the racist American government escalates in Vietnam, the police agencies of America escalate the oppression of Black people throughout the ghettos of America. Vicious police dogs, cattle prods, and increased patrols have become familiar sights in Black communities. City Hall turns a deaf ear to the pleas of Black people for relief from this increasing terror. And here you hear Bobby Seale's just plea that after so long of trying to stop the consequences of dehumanizing rhetoric on the Black community, that this was part of the lead up to the choices that the Panthers made. So these are some photos. The Black Panthers had been doing a number of social programs in Oakland, such as free school breakfast, along with kind of autonomous patrolling of their neighborhood for safety, observing traffic stops and other police interventions, almost like immediate face-to-face precursor to what we're seeing now in the in communities where people are taking cell phone videos of traffic stops in real time and live streaming those out to the world as a means of holding police accountable. So in addition, the Black Panthers were carrying guns in public as a symbol of strength, autonomy, and power in ways that were completely legal. Open carry of firearms was completely legal in California until the Black Panthers started doing it regularly in their neighborhoods. And that was when a Republican representative proposed what came to be known as the Panther Bill. Don Mulford proposed this that would halt open carry laws in California as a direct response to the Panthers. So on May 2nd, 1967, 24 men and 6 women walked into the state capitol building during session, pointing rifles or shotguns to the sky while the session was ongoing. Lawmakers became so alarmed that they dove under their desks at the sight of the Panthers carrying guns, again, which was at the time a legal act to do. And as you can see, the Sacramento Bee's response is, "Capitol is invaded." Later, J. Edgar Hoover would name the Panthers as, quote, "a Black nationalist hate-type organization." And this would come to increase membership in the Black Panthers, actually, by 5,000, as the gun became a kind of rhetorical symbol of power and autonomy in this case. Since then, a lot has changed and a lot has stayed the same. Following the embarrassment of the 1999 World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, local city police departments got wise on the need to control the symbolic environment of a protest, and so we see an increasing militarization of local police departments with really expensive high-tech equipment to totally quash dissent and control the environment of protest. And then this is a picture of the new Black Panther Party, which the Southern Poverty Law Center and others recognize as a hate organization. But this is a protest that the group had organized in March of 2015 at the South by Southwest Music Festival in Austin, appropriating the tactics of the Black Panthers to bring a symbol of violence, the gun, into a public space. The way that this appeared in my internet search on a website called the GOP Daily Dose, with the headline, "Watch Armed Black Muslims Chant for the Murder of Police Officers in Austin, Texas." And the article later went on to say that because the new Black Panther Party supported the Nation of Islam, that made them a Black Muslim organization. And I think that the real, I guess, lesson that I'm kind of drawing, or the argument that I want to make here, is how nuanced our understanding of violent images should be. Who do we consider violent, and how folks who are carrying guns in the street as an act of protest, after several other forms of protest have not worked, are now being lumped together by the alt-right. And other examples with that came up in my search for this, there's a website called The Daily Wire, which is another alt-right source. The title of the article was 10 Worst Anti-Cop Signs at Black Lives Matter Rallies. And it lumped together signs that said, "Killer cops create cop killers," which to me is not so much a statement dehumanizing or inciting violence against specific police officers as it is a legitimate protest statement against practices of policing that are disproportionately and violently affecting Black communities. And while it would be easier to accept a more abstract statement of violence like this, this anarchist image related to smashing the state, I would just like us to ponder the questions of how does the messenger's body affect our interpretation of someone's uptake of dehumanizing rhetoric, and how easily do we conflate appeals to end police violence against Black people with direct responsibility for killing individual police. So thank you once again for.
Thanks very much. This is, I'm here selfishly mostly because I wanted to hear everyone else speak. And what I'm going to say is actually, it's not particularly funny. I want to talk about, end by talking about a different kind of violence. That harsh words. Hi, nice to see you. That's okay. And I don't know whether to consider this a kind of legal violence or a violence of denial or the violence of delegitimacy, but what I want to talk about is two recent trajectories that we can trace the history of. They're in some ways really traceable to 2010, of violent words about Islam in the US context, and look at the ways they come together, and look at what impact that has and is having. There is also a very long history of anti-Islamic rhetoric, some imagery, but it's mostly rhetoric. I'm happy to talk about it in other moments, but I'm talking about something else here, and I'm talking about something else that is in some ways less grounded. There's a long history of Muhammad as making up a false religion with the product of a renegade Christian monk training a bird to do false revelation in his ear. This is a different history. This is much more recent. And so what I'm talking about here is something that comes very specifically out of, I think, a very well-intentioned post-9/11 effort by George W. Bush to focus not on Islam but on Muslims. And so George W. Bush is remembered for many things, but one thing that I remember him for is that he was the most frequent flyer at American mosques of any US president that we've had. He was at mosques, particularly the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., all the time. For obvious reasons, Barack Obama did not follow this trajectory. For obvious reasons, we don't have presidents before him who do this, but he's really, he's quite unique in doing this, very much a post 9/11 phenomenon. And so he makes his first mosque visit on the 16th, on September 16th, 2001, and among the various things he says is that the attacks of 9/11 had nothing to do with Islam. Islam is not a religion of violence. Islam is a religion of peace. It's a very, very well-intentioned statement. There are etymological connections between the SLM of the word for peace and the word for Islam. What it has done for people who don't like Islam is set up what I think of as the kind of ongoing argument of 5-year-olds since 2001, which is Islam is a religion of peace. No, Islam is a religion of violence. No, Islam is a religion of peace. No, Islam is a religion of violence. And so on the one hand, you get people who quote from the Quran things like, God has created you from nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. In other words, God has created humans in all their diversity, and this is God's intent. And then on the other hand, you get people who say the other quote, which is, kill the unbelievers wherever you find them. That quote is taken out of context, but it's a very powerful quote, and extremists and Islamophobes both like it to use it all the time. But what I'm pointing out here, and these images are all, these are not done by trained graphic artists. None of what I'm looking at is done by professionals. None of them are even done by hand-drawn artists. I can certainly talk about that, particularly in the Draw Muhammad contest approaches, but these are all put together kind of Photoshop personal creations, mostly found on anti-Islam websites, but also on sites like Red Hot Conservative. So these are, but these are a very small sampling. I chose these because they fit well on a PowerPoint screen, but there were many, many options to choose from, all oriented around this argument that Islam is a religion of violence, not a religion of peace. So this is the first trajectory. And certainly there were pre-George W. Bush, he did not invent the idea that promoting a positive view of Islam came from arguing that Islam was a religion of peace. But I would say that the moment in which he used it and the airplay that it got set up this much more recent debate. So that's the first trajectory. Okay, the second one, which we can date, again, very specifically to 2010, is the argument about Islam as integrally connected to Sharia, and specifically this kind of hybrid terminology that has been created, which is Sharia Law. And this feeds the argument that Islam is not a religion but a political ideology that is inherently focused on laws. This does pick up on a longer kind of Enlightenment era argument that Islam was a religion of laws and Muhammad was, as he was described, the lawgiver of the Arabs. This at the time was seen very positively, and so if you've seen Denise Spellberg's work on Thomas Jefferson owning a copy of the Quran, reading it, and suggesting that it be read in all universities, he meant law schools. And so this was understood very positively. Again, this is not that history. That's a very interesting history, but this is not that history. We have no mentions of Sharia law in any major US news outlet before 2010. The only times in which they talk about it are in the context of things happening in Muslim-majority societies elsewhere. It's not usually described positively, but it is never used in an American context. It never comes up in 1979. It never comes up in any of the issues in Lebanon in the 80s. It never comes up with Libya in the 80s. It never comes up in the 90s, and it never comes up after 9/11. This comes up only in 2010. It primarily comes up, the top is a billboard from Oklahoma, because Oklahoma is the state that comes up with the first anti-Sharia amendment in 2010 called the SOS Save Our State Amendment. It ultimately is struck down on First Amendment grounds in 2013, but it has been followed by multiple others. Up to 16 states have passed or are in the process of passing amendments. They have learned not to use the word Sharia. They simply talk about not allowing international laws or foreign laws. But this promotion of Islam as a real Muslim endorses Sharia law, and a fake Muslim is one who pretends not to endorse Sharia law, but does it secretly. And you can see this also. It's very much also connected to Obama as a secret Muslim. So you can find ample examples of that too. What I'm focusing on here is that this is, again, a very recent trajectory with a very specific history that presents Islam as a very rigid religion, one that is totally connected to law and is aimed at hostile takeover. This is where we get phrases like creeping Sharia. And then finally, where these two trends come together is what I'm suggesting is not an act of spectacular violence, but an act of invisible and insidious violence, which is the push to suggest that Islam is not a religion at all. This is a different argument from historical arguments about Islam or Judaism being false religions and people being misguided in following them. This is about the argument that Islam is not a religion, it is a political ideology, it is a political agenda masquerading as a religion to fool people until it can conduct state capture, global capture, and take over. This is very new. The reason I'm saying that it's particularly insidious is because it's a particularly American argument that has American consequences. We see this being used very subtly in anti-mosque zoning campaigns. When people don't want mosques, they argue on grounds of it will overtax the sewers, it will cause too much traffic, it is zoned, C1 versus C3 or something else. But the rhetoric behind it is Islam is not a real religion. This is not a house of worship. We should not have this non-house of worship masquerading as a house of worship here. That's on a kind of small scale level, but on a much broader national level, what this means to say that Islam is not a religion is also to say that it doesn't enjoy the constitutional protections afforded by a religion. I would say that the recent discussions about Michael Flynn and his comments about Islam have focused on this as a kind of talking point, but have not thought through what this really means. And I would suggest that stuff like this, as aesthetically unappealing and unsophisticated as it is something that we should be paying more attention to. This is a very subtle form of violence. This is ultimately a very legal form of violence, but in an American context, I would suggest that this is a profound foundational form of violence, because if Islam is no longer a religion, it is not the Moonies, it is not Scientology, it is an illegal effort to pretend to be a religion, and therefore Muslims are that much more vulnerable. So. That is also unfortunate, but it is actually much more than that. So I'll just close there.
So I leave us all to worry about that a bit more. Thank you. And please thank our panelists.